Joseph Fallon, welcome to the Laissez-Faire video podcast. You're the author of Lincoln Uncensored. Let me ask, first of all, the question that's on everybody's mind. How long did it take you to get through 10 volumes of Lincoln's works?
Overall, this is about 4 years, because I didn't do it consistently. I began originally in a series of articles for Chronicle magazine, and then they suggested, could you put something together as a book? And then I came out with more articles, and it just kept on growing, the topic-wise, until it was about, as I said, 4 years, going through Basler's works and then other related works, like Thomas D. Lorenzo, Edgar Lee Waters, Minter, and Craven.
Yeah, and your view was that readers needed just a kind of a one-volume compendium of everything that Lincoln actually said as the best way to give a full picture of who he was and what he did.
Yeah, I wanted a one-volume reference work so that the first two-thirds would be his quotations, sort of like one volume of Bartlett's famous quotations, but it would be Lincoln's famous quotations, taking 24 subjects that I felt were important, from slavery to the tariff, the Constitution, war, and in each subject, arrange what he said on that subject chronologically. I wanted people to be able to make up their own minds, instead of too often you have historians saying, let me give you my interpretation of what he means. I wanted people to read the book and his words and make up their own mind what they thought. It could reaffirm their beliefs, their convictions, or it could challenge them.
You know, I think you raise an interesting point here. One of the things I've noticed, I mean, you even picked this up from the newest Lincoln movie. It's not so much that there's 100% denial about the reality of his views on race or his views on habeas corpus or whatever. It's just that there's a lot of people who think that all this stuff was justified for the larger goal, right?
Right. And that's where I see a similarity today and with Lincoln with regard to presidents claiming that for national defense or some variation of that, they have the right to declare war without Congress, or the right to put people away without, with President Obama, extrajudicial assassinations. No habeas corpus, no legal restraints. And the thing is, when you get to something like habeas corpus, which is the cornerstone of our system, going back to the Magna Carta, it's a matter of self-interest. To support it is being selfish. If it can be to someone else, it can be done to you. That's why you want your opponent to have all the legal rights before the judge, before the courts, with the lawyer confidentiality, because you may need them yourself sometime. If it can be done to someone else, it can be done to you. Now, with the issue of the war, we go back to Madison, who had said no country can maintain its freedom if it's at continual warfare.
Yeah.
The corruption engenders debts, taxes, fraud. And that's another thing.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense too. Well, I mean, you find this even in such things as the controversy over whether FDR, knew about Pearl Harbor in advance. More and more, you find people that say, "Well, yeah, he knew," but that's what's justified for war. That's what's cool. That's what's essential. And I suppose you find the same thing among Lincoln scholars too. People just have different judgments. Some people think that dictatorship was justified.
There's a famous historian. His name escapes me right now, but he said he was a dictator, but he was a great democratic dictator. It's sort of like we're a democracy, but we have an empire. They're oxymorons. You can't be a democracy, have an empire. You can't be a dictator and say you're functioning under some type of constitutional or democratic system.
Your book has one of the clearest statements I've ever read about the problem of the revenue issue. As I understood your presentation, and as I put it in my review, essentially the Southern secession threatened the revenue stream for the central government, and Lincoln understood that as well as anybody.
Yeah, Lincoln, remarkably, the greatest analysis at the time was by the British papers on the fact that the way the system was working, the tariffs, at the time it was around 18%. Under Lincoln, in one of the British papers that I cite, the Morel tariff jumped it up to double that. And they're saying why, and it seemed to be offering business interests, financial interests in the North, something to support the war. If you get the war, we can have this much of an increase for you. The British papers had said that the South and the West were subjected to double taxation through the tariff. That is, the northern states in many ways would be today a failed state. That is, since the Washington administration, you have the tariff, which was supposed to ensure economic independence. Alexander Hamilton in Washington said you couldn't have political independence if you didn't have economic independence from Britain. So the idea was to create a tariff that would have Americans support American industry, build it up, and eventually be self-reliant, and we could be independent economically as well. It didn't turn out that way. For 90 years, it became a system of too often fraud and misuse, and as some of the British papers pointed out, the South and West had subjected to double taxation. That is, that they were paying to get the tariff, to get superior goods. But then the money that was accrued by Washington was not evenly distributed. It mostly went disproportionately to the North for their interests. Now, Lincoln had been a great supporter of the American system of Henry Clay, which was internal improvements, used taxpayers' money for canals, turnpikes, railroads, or whatnot. But it was such a corrupt system that by the time of the Civil War, of the 35 states, 33 had outlawed it in their state by state statute, and within the first year, I believe, 1862 at the latest, the last two states had abolished it. So the very system that Lincoln championed could only be maintained if it now power was in the federal government.
And you used the figures something like, was it 73%, 75% of federal revenue came through this kind of tariff measures.
That's why one of the first things Lincoln did, Lincoln had three positions with regard to the South secession. The very first one was, okay, but you got to pay our tariffs. We're going to collect the tariffs in the ports. Then later he changed it that it was for union, and then later he changed it for emancipation. The very first one, in my opinion, is the reason that he gave that was honest, and that is his system, what he believed so passionately in. The American system can only be maintained since it had been repudiated by the states, if it was maintained by the federal government, and that required the controlling the tariffs, ensuring the South still pays them. But it's a little oxymoron. How can he, on the one hand, say they don't have the right to secede, and then say, okay, you can, but we just want the revenues to still come our way?
You know, I think it helped me, anyway, to understand this issue a little bit more, to look at it in light of, say, current events. You know, you only have to imagine what would Bush or Obama or some other executive do if suddenly faced with some seceding states, the results of which would blow the federal budget, you know, apart and make it impossible for them to pay back their political friends and do all the things that politicians do, you know.
Yeah.
And it helps, at least when I think about it in those terms, it helps account for the motivation, the weird sort of driving passion that Lincoln had for this idea of the Union.
Yeah, when he comes and says that the Union created the states, he comes with ideas that they're just not true. And he goes with that. To me, the only word is delusion. I mean, you have the Constitution. The Constitution was called by was called by Congress of the Articles of Confederation, represented by the states. Then the states sent their delegates. Then the states had to ratify it. Then the states can only amend it. And so where he comes up with that this union was created, in turn created the states, I don't see, but it was this mythic idea. And too often, the union without the Constitution, in my opinion, is a prison house.
Yeah.
The greatness of the union is the Constitution, and if you separate the two, you have serious problems.
Yeah. One of the things that emerges in reading your book, and I'm sure this was deliberate, but in some of the sections you see an evolution, or really just an outright change or contradiction in Lincoln's own stated views.
Yeah. One of the things for me was the Great Sioux Indian Uprising of 1862, where he, after being told that they're starving to death, misleads Congress later, saying he didn't know, even though he sent his own aide, Nikolai, out there in July. The event occurred in August. And the way he changed his views, sometimes it's not evolution, as they say, where the course of practical experience means that you have to temper or taper or change. But sometimes, in my opinion, there didn't seem to be a rational way that he could make these statements. I mean, to Congress, he was lying. The one thing he did do, if I may say, with regard to the Sioux Uprising, he did keep his word to the governor and the senator of Minnesota. He said if he could just hang 39 Indians, and the Minnesotans accept that, then later he would be able to expel all the Indians from Minnesota. He said that he had to only hang 38, excuse me, and this is the single largest mass execution in U.S. history still. All men on the same platform on the same day in Nakato, Minnesota. He said that there was conspiracy. The uprising was a conspiracy by the Confederacy. I mean, he makes statements that I have yet to see evidence to prove it.
So there's a paranoia that your book demonstrates, I think, that in the mind of Lincoln, that he always believes that there's people out to get him.
Him and also Stanton. As the Secretary of War, there's a quote in there where he says, at the very beginning of the term, there are traitors everywhere. There's traitors in the post office. There's traitors in the State Department. There's traitors in the ranks of the Army. Washington, we have to basically purge because of these people who are unreliable. But the interesting thing about all of this for me is, one of them, at the Republican Convention, 1860, the presumptive nominee was Seward of New York. He lost to Lincoln, but one of the reasons is he was the one that came up with this idea that there was this irrepressible conflict with the South. And at the Republican Party's own convention, it was the Western delegates that were a major source of saying, no, there is no need for war. And that helped to lose Seward the nomination. It wasn't the only reason, but it was remarkable that within the Republican Party at that time, the West did not see that there was a sectional issue that required violence to settle. In fact, the Republican Party early on, 1861, was trying to come with a compromise. So I have in the book the committees in the House and the committee in the Senate that were trying to seek some type of compromise. Remember when the seven southern states left, the upper states like Virginia were thinking that they could coax them back through some type of compromise. And we have in the book the letters from Lincoln and the writing of his secretary Nikolai, how Lincoln was opposed to any compromise. And he gives the reason. If we have compromise, we're not going to have a political party anymore. We're going to be out of office. Now that seems to be a major point that I think we should, historians talking about Lincoln should discuss. That when you have at the very beginning an attempt to resolve an issue without bloodshed, and the man says, no, if bloodshed comes, we might have to resort to that, but to find out there's no moral principle. It's not, we don't want to deal with slave owners, it's, our party is going to die, we're going to lose office. That's things that you don't read about often, unless you go to the other books like Thomas DiLorenzo or Edgar V. Masters and people like that. But they're usually not given too much prominence in the main media.
You know, it's awful to read the fullness of the data that you present in your book. And as I've been talking to people about this over the last few days, the question keeps coming back. Did anybody really know at the outset, where events were leading? At the end of the whole thing, it was so ghastly, and it's so obvious that practically any other method would have been preferred to eliminate slavery, if that was your goal, which it's not clear that was Lincoln's goal, which is part of the point of your book. But do you get the sense that there was just a series of missteps along the way that kind of led to just an unbelievable calamity, and that day after day after day, the North had to win the war, so there had to be more slaughter, more bloodshed, more catastrophe? Or do you see it as that Lincoln and his friends understood the stakes and understood what they were about to do?
I think he understood the stakes. Maybe not at the beginning. There was all talk that at the Battle of First Manassas at Bull Run, there would be a short war. You had people coming out to picnic to watch the battle, thinking that it would be something of a classical European, two armies meet, one side holds the ground and the war is over, especially if you couldn't capture the capital. Manassas was so close to D.C., it would have been defeat. But it evolved into total war. The U.S., the history was that concepts that had restrained war before, over the last 500 years, were being discarded. So we have the famous U.S. Army General Order Number 100. Under the Constitution of the U.S., Congress is supposed to ensure punishment for violations of what's called laws of nations. And in Article 6, it says that in addition to the Constitution, international treaties are supreme law of the land. Well, for 100 years, approximately, the Code of Conduct for Warfare was the Vattel Code from Emmerich Vattel, Switzerland. And we operated that prior to 1861. But Lincoln authorized Francis Lieber to come up with his own code. He was a jurist. And it says short wars are the best war. I'm paraphrasing. And therefore, in order to save lives, you kill lives. There was a disconnect going on. I mean, if you read it, it will say it is prohibited to destroy private property, except if authorized by a higher command. You cannot kill POWs unless the commanding officer feels somehow they could be a threat to him. Things that weren't allowed for 100 years were now. It was getting out of control. I think they thought originally it could be a short war. I think that they didn't think it would evolve this way. But once it did, I think Lincoln and his administration decided that they would pursue it to the end, which meant having a whole new legal code, justifying things. And what you have in many ways is, with the conduct towards the South, was preliminary for the conduct towards the Indians. Because you have Sherman, who is quoted in the book in the endnotes, that to the secessionists, to the secessionists, I'm trying to see, woman and child, wife and child, death is a good answer, something to that effect. And then later to the idea that where he writes to Sheridan, just kill all the Indians. If they don't stay where they are, they don't know their place. And I think we had a horrible war that established a principle on how to conduct it that, to me, just my opinion, seems Orwellian. That in order to save lives, you target civilians. Nowadays, we don't even call them civilians. We just say collateral damage. And there's like an acceptance. We don't want to know. You know, that's. Have you read Mark Twain's The War Prayer?
I have.
Yeah, that's what people should read. I wish I'd put that in.
Yeah.
Something in the beginning.
It's very powerful. So you have in this war really a foreshadowing of so much else that we saw in the 20th century. This sort of mass death, this utter disregard for human rights, for legalities. You know, the sense that there's no limits to war. There's no more rules of warfare. Everything's fair game. The only goal is to vanquish the enemy utterly and completely.
Yeah. Yeah, there's unconditional surrender, nothing else. And that drags out the war. You also have the interesting thing that with regard to 1865, you have the Hampton Roads negotiations between Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis about Davis asking, you know, okay, what are the terms? The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, wrote about it in his multi-volume history. And he said, this is controversial, Lincoln asked that the South come back now so that they could defeat the 13th Amendment. If they come in, they could vote it down. The whole thing was it was a war strategy. If he can get the Union, that's all he wanted. But it was his version of the Union. And it's everything that people like Alexander Hamilton, a centralist, really, who had said no state could be, if you adopt the Constitution during the ratification debate, no state could be kept within the Union by bayonets. No one's agreeing to that. And that's the Union that we had. You had a very troubling decision by the Supreme Court in 1861, the Prize case. And it set, in my opinion, two precedents were established that were harmful for the interests of the U.S. One is, historically, international law recognizes the right of a neutral to trade with belligerents. So during the War of 1812, we had been trading during the Napoleonic Wars with Britain and France, even though France had tried to have a blockade on the UK. Now you go 40 years later, neutral powers, in this case Spain, with its colony was Cuba, was trading with the Confederacy, and their ships were seized because Lincoln had the blockade. It goes to the courts, and the courts first said, no, the president could never declare war against a state, or declare war at all. It's not his power. And that a Congress could not declare war against a state or a group of states. But then they said, since the Constitution allows for the suppression of rebellion, the president has that authority. Well, historically, rebellion, Shays Rebellion, Whiskey Rebellion, it was disgruntled farmers because of high taxes or debased currency, or veterans who were not being given their pensions, that took up arms against the state government. Then the state government would appeal to the other states to help. That was all turned over by this decision where all of a sudden a duly, legally, constitutionally elected state government could be declared by a federal government to be in rebellion, and then allowing the federal government anything you need to suppress the rebellion. The history was turned on its head, the law was turned on its head, and it establishes a precedent by that case that the federal government, it can declare an elected state government in rebellion and take action against that government. That's not a union.
Sometimes it seems, when I look at the driving motivation of the seceding states, that they were naive. really.
Yeah. It once said that all they had to do is just stay. Stay in the Senate and they could stop anything Lincoln wanted. Lincoln was repudiated by nearly two-thirds of the electorate. He only got 39% of the vote. He had nothing in the South. The Democrats didn't like him. He was considered an extremist in his rhetoric. If they stayed in, they could have just sandbagged him. But this had been brewing for such a long time, and one of the issues was, one, not the most important, just one, free trade versus protectionism. The North was based on protectionism, the South on free trade. And yes, that included the exploitation of slave labor. But there were two fundamental principles. You can have free trade without slavery. And Lincoln was opposed to that. So you have the writings of, again, the British papers are fantastic. Well, we share the same language, so they know our history and appreciate it to some degree, talking about how it was incompatible now. They were two separate economic systems. One would have to dominate, the other two would have to lead. Now, interestingly, at the time of secession, there was a great number of editorials in northern newspapers, and there's a 2-volume work, magnificent work, God knows how long the man took to compile these, editorials of northern papers at that time, and most of them just said, let the South go. We're tired. We're tired of the constant disputes going on over tariffs principally, but other issues as well. But at the same time, as the British papers pointed out, the loss of revenue, and also the shipping. The U.S. would not, the North would lose the not just the tariff, but the shipping from the South as well. But secession had been part of the U.S. history historically. In 1866, Lord Acton, famous British philosopher, teacher, politician, had famous for the paraphrase quote, "Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely," had written to General Lee saying he grieved more for what was lost at Appomattox than he rejoiced at what was saved at Waterloo. Yeah. And he goes on to say why that was, and he said the principle of secession was the one thing to prevent an arbitrary government. Yeah. It was not a destruction, it was a salvation. So historically, the movement of secession was always north.
You should also add about Lord Acton. This was a great champion of modernity, of human freedom, an opponent of tyranny of all sorts. And in that same quotation, he predicts that a northern victory would unleash a terrible empire on the world.
Ironically, just in passing as a footnote, the greatest supporter of the North was Karl Marx.
Yeah, of the North.
Of the North, he favored that was an industrial society. It was progressive.
You know, a very interesting point there, because we're not used anymore to leftists favoring industrial progress. A very interesting twist in left-wing ideology. Well, listen, Joseph, I'm going to let you go. First of all, your book is amazing. Secondly, I'm stunned, just an honor to have a chance to visit with you. I've appreciated very much everything you've said. I think we could all be your students for months on end. You're a marvelous teacher and expositor. So I want to thank you for letting the Laissez-Faire Club handle distribution of your book. I very much appreciate it.
I'm very honored. Thank you.
Can get the book by joining the club, or they can go to your Amazon site or Barnes & Noble or Lulu. And I wish you all the best. And let's please stay in touch. And thank you again for all you've done.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.